All right, you guys, we're gonna go ahead and we'll get started, okay? So you guys can, I can give you back your time, okay? Thank you so much for coming again. Today we're going to be talking about working with survivors, confidentiality, ethics, communication, and trauma-informed care. So if you would like to pop something into the chat, what's one thing that you have learned from the training so far? It has been a lot of good information, so if you would like to put something, that would be great. It's a lot of good information that we've been going over. I will be sending out our YouTube link today with some of the trainings that I've already uploaded so you guys can start watching them. Okay, I will get that sent out to you today, okay? All right, so of course, these are our objectives for today. Um, Specifically how to work with survivors, what are the policies of confidentiality, making ethical decision making, how to effectively communicate, and also utilize trauma-informed care with survivors. So when it comes to confidentiality, that's the forefront of everything that we do, okay? And confidentiality, specifically with sexual assault survivors, matters because sexual assault is that loss of control over one's bodies and choices. It's important that we're working with survivors and they know that we are aiming to have them regain their control. And that includes deciding who knows about the assault, okay? And we want to give that client autonomy back, okay? Strict confidentiality helps survivors determine who does and doesn't receive information, and that's important. So how do we deliver that in survivor support services? Well, for starters, that's the fundamental principle in providing our services. In addition to, survivors do expect that information shared with an advocate will remain private, and that's very important. That has everything to do with how we build rapport, how they learn to trust again. So advocates must ensure that survivors understand those confidentiality policies and the limits, because there are limits that to the confidentiality that we'll go over in just a minute. Okay. Confidentiality plays such a crucial role in helping us to build trust, safety, and empowerment in survivor support. So, as a program, as a sexual assault crisis center or a rape crisis center, we have certain confidentiality policies and legal considerations. For starters, sexual violence programs must have clear policies. It is written in our policies and procedures manual. You guys all have that on a USB drive, so please review that um, and the information that we have pertaining to FIC's policies. So we do receive funding from VAWA, which is the Violence Against Women's Act, and VOCA, which is the Victims of Crime Act, which requires as an agency that we maintain confidentiality as a legal requirement. Okay. We do have to give consent. So clients have to give consent. So we do have to have consent before we can provide any disclosure. And this means that a client has to have a written, informed of what that consent entails and time limited consent as a requirement before sharing any information. There are, of course, some exceptions, of course, when disclosure is legally mandated, as in being subpoenaed or child abuse reporting or even court orders. Okay. And when that exception occurs, the survivor should be notified of that disclosure, preferably in advance. And of course, efforts are made to try to protect the survivor's privacy as best as possible. Okay. So understand that although we do have confidentiality policies, it's not absolute, and survivors must be informed of those specific exceptions. So what are those exceptions? For instance, for starters, confidentiality must be broken in the following situations. Number one, if there's a threat of harm to themselves or others. So if a survivor poses a threat or danger to themselves or others, the advocate has a duty to warn and protect, okay? And so this is very important. There will be one of two ways where if they are a hinder to themselves, we may call 911. It just depends on the severity of the situation, okay? Also, if the survivor's request for information release, so a survivor may request that information to be shared with third parties, officials, or agencies. So we should use a consent to release that the survivor actually completes in full for any information about that survivor to be shared with any other agency, third parties, and things of that nature. That signed release must also specify what specific information is going to be released and how long that release is valid. Okay. Then there are court-ordered releases of information. So if a subpoena is actually issued, a court order may require disclosure to their records or case notes or files as well. So that happens when there is a subpoena that happens. And then, of course, supervisory discussion. So, of course, among that advocate, they may share survivor information with their supervisor for case management, of course. So, we all do that to make sure that we're referring to our supervisor for additional support. And so, that is always something that is given as well. Then there's mandated reported of child abuse, okay? So within the state of Texas, it is required that if a survivor discloses physical, emotional, or sexual abuse of a child, that the advocate is legally required to report it to CPS, okay? All right, that's very important. Understand that confidentiality does not apply if a third party, friend, family member is present during the discussions, okay? So the key is to understand that survivors must always be informed of those limitations of confidentiality and given control over that information whenever is possible. So why are releases and waivers important? So again, with our waivers or the consent to releases, they must be a written release form that has to be signed by the survivor before any details about a sexual assault case can be discussed with another party, okay? This also includes confirming whether the survivor even sought services at your agency. For example, if a detective asks an advocate about a survivor's case, the advocate cannot disclose any information unless we have that written signed release. Okay. And that release matters because, of course, we want to protect the survivor's privacy and control and ensure that no information is shared without their explicit consent. Okay. As well as other agencies, they are doing the same thing for us. If we call to ask, we could always they were like, hey, I don't have a release. Sometimes we can send it to them to make sure that they know that the survivor has signed the release for us to be able to communicate with them. And this helps advocates, attorneys, and law enforcement as we all work together with sexual assault survivors to navigate confidentiality appropriately. So what are some legal protections? Okay, so advocates communicating on behalf of survivors, sometimes advocates can do that. Sometimes that's a part of that advocacy portion of it. And in some cases, this extends to the attorney-client privilege to cover client communications as well, okay? What we know is that a client, attorney-client privilege provides a stronger protection than standard advocate confidentiality. So all parties must understand what the type of confidentiality protection is and the limits of that as well. So who's required to sign the release? So before any survivor information, a written release must be required for disclosure to any law enforcement. So this includes police officers, detectives that might be on their case as well. Okay, any legal professionals. So before you talk to a DA or any other victim liaisons or witness staff, we do have to have that consent release. Any information, if a friend or family, of course, we can't confirm deny, but if the client does give that release because that is something that if they want, they can. We could utilize that for any friends or family members or any school personnel if the survivor is a student. Okay. So the key thing is that even well-intended individuals, such as family, cannot receive information without the survivor's explicit written consent. So what are some essential components in that release? So when we complete our consent to release form, we have to include the purpose. Okay. So, you have the name of the individual. We need to know the purpose of why this information is being released. Okay. This could be helping them out with their housing assistance or helping them with navigating through their police case, right? What is the scope? So what specific information is being shared? We do need to leave that the recipient. So who is receiving that information? So what law enforcement agency, KPD, whoever it is. This could be Bell County, the county clerk office, who's receiving this information. They do have the date that they actually signed it. So when the release was authorized, also time limits, when the release actually expires. Okay, so we could give up to a year. The client does have that right to explicitly state how long the release is. And then they do have the right to revoke it at any time. Okay. So a client can, even though they signed it and it may be, let's say, they gave it for a year, they maybe no longer are using services, they can revoke that at any time. Or if they don't feel comfortable having that information, they can revoke that too. Okay. And these components are important because it ensures the survivor retains that full control over what is shared and with whom. Okay. And it limits over disclosure of certain sensitive information and aligns with legal and ethical guidelines. So when we're talking about ethics, so ethics specifically are rules of behavior based on moral duty and obligation, okay? These are a set of moral values that govern how we act within a profession, okay? And it ensures that survivors have safety, trust, and advocacy integrity. So why is this important? So of course, survivors place trust in their advocates. It's one of our core values here at Families in Crisis. If you haven't had a chance to look at the values that we have on our website, it's a great information for you to do that. And trust is one of those factors. So they have to be able to trust us. So if they are coming to us for assistance, they trust that their information is safe and that we're doing things ethically correct. Okay. Some ethical missteps, if they are done, can lead to emotional harm or even re-victimization. They can also blur professional boundaries. So having those boundaries are important in making sure that we are adhering to good ethical behavior. And then, of course, in some cases, there are legal and professional consequences for certain advocacy programs if ethics are violated. Okay. So what are some key differences when we're working with our volunteers versus our professionals? Okay. So for volunteer advocates, of course, part of this program is to not only train staff, but all train local community partners as well as volunteers who may be interested in becoming a sexual assault advocate as well. And they are not required to have a professional license to be a volunteer, but professional advocates, those that we are governed by professional licensing bodies, specifically with those that are specific with this training and adhering to the guidelines from our grantors, okay? Our volunteer advocates can be well trained, but it's not formally regulated. Our professional advocates, as yourselves, must adhere to those written ethical standards, okay? Volunteer advocates have motivation is often personal experience. So a lot of people, why do they want to work or volunteer in this line of work? A lot are motivated by their own personal experience with maybe sexual assault, domestic violence, or wanting to give back to the community. Professional advocates come into this work, to make sure that they're adhering. But if they do have ethical violations, this could be lost if they are licensed specifically for ethical violations. Ethics matters in advocacy because being ethical can sometimes have ethical breaches. Even unintentional ones can sometimes happen, and which can cause harm, re-victimization, and disrupt the healing process. Okay. So advocates must recognize that even having very good intentions do not replace ethical responsibility. Having boundaries. So we know we talk a lot about this even with our survivors, but also adhering to boundaries within the profession. Okay. Boundaries matter because it helps to maintain the survivor's trust and safety. It also prevents certain power imbalances between the survivor and the advocate and protects the integrity of that advocate survivor relationship so that it does not cross into like a friendship. Okay. So what are some common boundary challenges among advocates? Well, survivors, they come in seeking friendships. How many times have we had a survivor that says, I really don't have a support system. I feel really comfortable with you. And there's nothing wrong with them being comfortable with you as long as we adhere to that boundary, right? And have them understand that, while you may feel connected and you may feel like you can trust them, we still have that advocate client or advocate survivor relationship. Okay. Advocates must gently reinforce those boundaries. Okay. So there's going to be certain things where clients may ask of you that may be ethically wrong. And so you must make sure that you are adhering to those guidelines. Okay. Encourage survivors to build their own personal support systems. Okay. So this could be through certain cultures. Sometimes we have people that are connected to certain cultures or religious aspects to building and meeting people new through that. Sometimes through an activity, you may find someone, the survivor may like to crochet. They might find a local crochet group. Having them build their own personal support systems and avoid personal relationships with survivors. So your relationships with your survivor should adhere to only on community company time. Okay. We should not be able to communicate with them outside of work hours, and avoid those personal relationships, even after they are considered no longer a current like FIC client, specifically within like whether shelter, housing outreach, even if they're no longer a client, they were a client here. We should avoid those personal relationships after the fact. Okay. So there's certain power dynamics in advocacy. So understand that even that advocate understand the advocate is technically the expert in this in information when it comes to sexual assault. They provide those services, and the survivor is actually the recipient of those services. Okay, so even when you may feel very connected and where it feels like a friendship, the survivor relies on the advocate to provide services, help them out, make referrals, making it an unequal relationship. Okay. And we have to keep those limits. Okay. Survivors have already experienced a major violation of boundaries. Okay. From their offender, right? And so sometimes it's hard when the waters are kind of muddied for them to understand how to create boundaries, what those boundaries look like. And so it relies on the advocate to actually adhere to that, making those clear professional limits even more critical. So how do you recognize ethical violations? Well, here are a few examples of some innocent but harmful boundary recognitions. Providing your personal contact information. So we should never, ever provide our personal information. Share your own personal history of abuse. This is always a thing that I always talk to my interns about. Do not share this information. This information is private, okay? You really want to be mindful of any personal information you provide to survivors in general, okay? Because you have to be mindful of how if you're sharing this so you can build connections with the survivor, are you sharing this so they could console you, okay? So there's very, very limited places where it would be okay for you to share personal information about your personal life, your situation with the survivor, okay? Accepting gifts, discounts, or even certain favors from survivors. So we shouldn't do that as well. Engaging in purely social interaction. So, hey, let's meet for coffee, or let's meet for dinner and we'll catch up. We shouldn't do that. Expressing personal frustrations about the police. So I know we have all been there. We've all had agencies we've worked with and had challenges. That information or frustration should be shared among staff or even with your supervisor, but never in front of the survivor. Okay. We want survivors to actually, of course, we want them to be honest about their feelings, but also know that not all police is bad, okay? Not all hospital or nursings are bad. We want them to trust these services that are available in the community and trust the legal system, even though sometimes it may not always be fair. We want them to still be able to, if they need to, contact these different entities, okay? And then encourage a specific course of action, okay? So we do not give advice, okay? We can lay things out. Here are your options. But again, like we hear our advocates say, hey, I can't make that decision for you, but here are your options. These are the pros and cons of either one. These are your victims' rights. This is what you have the right to. You have the right to report. You don't have the right to report. We should not be like, hey, I think you should report. Here are your options. whatever you want to do, client autonomy, remember. So it is always the advocate's responsibility to maintain those boundaries and not the survivors. So when we're maintaining ethical standards, we have to be constant self-monitoring of our own interactions. Okay. So am I displaying good ethics? Okay. Be aware of those subtle boundary shifts. Okay. And also have those clear professional communications. Make sure that expectations among that survivor-client relationship, they are aware of that. Okay. Also, educating volunteers, intern staff about any ethical risks. So, for as a final thought, just as the perpetrator is always responsible for an assault, the advocate's always responsible for maintaining those ethical boundaries, okay? And survivors should never bear that burden of monitoring those professional relationships. That is the advocate's responsibility. So, what are some basic ethical principles when we're working with sexual assault advocacy? Well, of course, the rights of survivors. So, survivors are entitled to knowledgeable assistance, okay? So, that means our advocates need to be well trained and they need to be informed on how to help our survivors. Privacy. So, protection of that personal information, okay? So, we must do that, and confidentiality. Respecting, okay? So the survivor has the right to respect. So always treat your survivors with respect, with dignity, and of course, without judgment. Survivors have the right to self-determination. So that means they have the right to make their own decisions without criticism or even opposition, okay? Your role as an advocate is to support that survivor's autonomy, whatever they want. We can provide guidance on decision making, provide those options, but at the end of the day, they have the right to choose what they want to choose. Okay. Also encourage explorations of certain positive and negative consequences. So, here's some options. A lot of clients, let's just say, for example, have trouble with learning how to pay which bill when money is actually limited. And so just providing that positive and negative consequences. Also, make sure your role is you do not impose your personal values or validate every choice, but respect the survivor's right to choose. Okay. When it comes to ethical advocacy, that means that we are actually empowering them to make their own decisions, not directing what we think that they should do. So being fair and flexible in advocacy. So we have to provide equal service for our survivors. So we can't do for one person what we wouldn't do for all. Okay. We have to make sure that we do not discriminate based on age, ethnicity, sexual orientation, or lifestyle. Okay. So make sure you're being fair across the board with all survivors. Okay. Providing all available options. So not just those that, that advocate just personally likes, provide all options to all survivors. Be flexible. So understand that recognizing when an approach is not helpful to survivor, okay? And also be willing to able to modify that when it's needed. So when it comes to the right to informed consent, an ethical advocate must provide survivors with information. So having said this, be careful with the first one, information about the advocate. So sometimes they do have the right to ask, hey, if you're trained, yes, I'm ethically trained, okay, if they ask, okay. They do have the right to ask that. That's part of that informed consent, okay. They could ask the agency's philosophy of counseling, so we don't have any, but there are some agencies that do have specific religious affiliations. So survivors must be informed before receiving services, okay? When it comes to confidentiality policies, they need to know about our confidentiality policies. We do have clients sign our confidentiality policies. In that, make sure you are explaining those limits and the exceptions to the confidentiality. And if in the case that we do crisis counseling, not therapeutic counseling, but they need to understand that relationship as well. Okay. Understand the duration and frequency of the sessions, that informed consent. What is that? If it's limited, certain shelters is a 30-day program, what that's going to look like. Housing may be up to a year or so, outreach visits as long as they want. They need to know what the duration and the frequency is, that how often, and that could be up to the survivor on how often they see an advocate, okay? There needs to be certain recourse for dissatisfaction. So survivors must be informed of their rights, okay, if they are unsatisfied with services. Okay, so they always have those rights, to even come, file a grievance, let them know, let someone know about the dissatisfaction. Of course, normally that's at the supervisor level, but they do have that right to actually talk to a supervisor if needed. Okay. We want advocates to ensure survivors are fully informed to make their own choices about their own care and support. So, what are some ethical guidelines for advocates? So, of course, we have to make sure we are not going to do harm. Our job is to prioritize survivor safety and the well-being, okay? Always promote the survivor's best interest. So ensure their choices and their dignity are respected, okay? Remember, this is not our lives, this is their lives. We want to make sure that we are adhering to that and not judging, okay? Be fair across the board, provide that unbiased support. Keep your word. So if you say that, hey, okay, I'm going to follow up with you in such and such time frame, make sure that you try to adhere to that. Sometimes, of course, things happen, or maybe, scheduling happens, but make sure you try to keep your word. That's very important when you're trying to build rapport with your clients, by helping maintain integrity and reliability. Okay. Maintain that confidentiality. Okay. So unless you're legally required to disclose, keep that confidentiality. That's very important. Okay. Respect the survivor's right to make informed decisions. Okay. So provide that accurate and timely information and respect them. Okay. Avoid conflicts of interest. So don't engage in dual relationships. Okay. With survivors or their families. Okay. And then accurately represent your abilities. Okay. So be honest. Okay. So this may not be something that is my level of expertise, but maybe I may need to ask my supervisor or maybe another coworker. Okay. You have help when it's needed. Okay. Key takeaway is ethical advocacy is built on trust, integrity, and survivor empowerment. So when it comes to guidance and supervision, so if you are facing an ethical concern, you should, of course, first seek guidance from your supervisor, okay? Maintain, of course, those professional boundaries and avoid gaining a personal gain in advocacy role, okay? And ensure all your actions align with those ethical standards. So as a final thought, ethical advocacy is an ongoing commitment that requires constant awareness of what we're doing, self monitoring to make sure we're adhering to those ethical guidelines and professional guidance. So, with communication, when we're working with survivors, we want to make sure we are actually actively communicating, okay, actively listening. And active listening involves communication between both the speaker and a listener. While much emphasis, a lot of people are like, oh, okay, we need to learn how to speak on this. Listening is just as important. So an active listening actually goes beyond just hearing what they say, but paying attention to what the speaker is saying. So what's the difference between active listening and passive listening? So passive listening means you're just hearing words, okay? You're not fully engaging. You have music, you have a lot of stuff going on. You kind of hear something, what they're saying, but you're really not paying attention, fully paying attention to it. Active listening gives full attention, okay? You like putting on headphones and focusing on me. You're giving that full attention to what they're trying to say. Active listening matters in advocacy because it increases sensitivities to survivor needs. They want to make sure that they're being heard. It helps to build trust and rapport and help survivors towards identifying their problems and taking actions. So when I talk a lot about communication, just as important in active listening are nonverbal. 80% of communication is nonverbal. Okay. So this means that paying attention to all the other areas the client is not necessarily saying, okay, but making sure how their demeanor may be. Okay. And there's several ways you can do that. Maintain good eye contact. Okay. You want to make sure you're sitting in front of your client. Sit up and lean in to show engagement that you are interested in what they're trying to say. Do not be on your phone. Sometimes you may turn off your computer or just not have your computer on because you want to make sure you're paying attention to them to eliminate distractions. Okay. When it comes to actual verbal communication, okay, you want to make sure you're using encouraging words when they're talking, right after they're talking. Right, okay, I see. That must have been hard for you. Okay, I can understand why this is frustrating for you. Okay, so those encouraging words help. You could also use paraphrasing. For example, okay, so you spoke to your sister and your sister said this and this made you feel. Okay, oh man, oh, how did that make you feel when this such happened? Okay. Open-ended questions are great because so when we're talking open-ended versus closed, so open-ended, ask for giving the survivor a chance to elaborate on their full situation. So I encourage open-ended questions. It gives you a broader view of what they're trying to convey as opposed to closed-ended. Closed-ended are like, hey, okay, did you pay your water bill? Yes or no? Okay, so those are closed-ended. Open-ended would be, okay, um, how was your budgeting this month for, we set a goal of $200. Were you able to do that? And what are some ways that you are able to maintain that, So have those open-ended questions where you actually produce dialogue, okay? What are you doing now? So understand that active listening includes both verbal and nonverbal, okay? It's about being present, being engaged, and validating. So how do we use active listening to actually build rapport? So number one, we have to listen with compassion, okay? Be sure to show warmth and concern, okay, when you're working with your survivor, okay? Check for understanding. We want to make sure that we understand. Am I understanding you correctly? And then paraphrasing, reiterate what they're saying just to make sure that we are accurately understanding them. Allow them to express their own crisis and problem, okay? They need to feel safe in coming to you with the problem, okay? Understand when it started, how it developed, and most important, how they feel, okay? Let them know that you're working together. This is a collaborative relationship, okay? So support them in their empowerment, okay? There may be certain things that you may need to work one-on-one with a survivor, and there may be things that survivors can do on their own because we want them to be self-sufficient eventually and actually learn how to be self-determined. So how do we help them with problems? Okay, so when we're trying to isolate what this specific issue is, our job is to help them sort out the issue. So break it down into manageable parts. So we have an issue, we possibly have a solution, but how can we get to that solution? Sometimes the problem is big and they may need to break that down. Identify what can and cannot be changed. This is very important, especially if you're working with clients that have extreme anxiety, okay? Working on, okay, is this something that I actually can change? If I cannot change, what are some other ways? What are things that can change? So focus on those actionable solutions that we actually can change. All right. Review sometimes past attempts. So avoid repeating ineffective strategies. So if you know that this particular client, like this does not work for them, then try to find a way to be able to actively listen and communicate with them in a way that's more effective for them. And this may be exploring new options. So what other choices do you think that you have? Okay. And then also consider those consequences of different actions. So what might happen if, we don't pay our bills, we're not being safe, or we go back home, when we're addressing safety guidelines or even safety planning, being able to consider those consequences to have that communication and dialogue between an advocate and survivors so that they can learn to make their own choices, okay? Your role is to help the survivor explore the problem, not solve it for them, okay? So, encouraging action. So, when we are helping them take steps towards certain resolutions, we want to help them develop a realistic plan. So, identify those small, achievable goals, okay? And encourage commitment. When do you think you could start? Can we do this? Okay. And of course, address the resistance. So sometimes you have clients that are just resistant, okay? So help them to identify and resolve those concerns about taking actions. Why would it be important for us to kind of rather than sit on this, actually be active in trying to produce a solution, okay? Providing support. So reassure them that help is available during the process. Okay. So you may refer somebody over to an agency. Hey, okay, try this, see if they're able to help you, and then reach back out to me if you were not able to get assistance, and then we can go from there. Okay. So provide that ongoing support. Avoid taking over. So we want to empower, like I said, it is a case by case scenario. All survivors are different. Some survivors will need a little bit more hand holding as you gradually start to help them with their independence. And some are ready to be independent. It just varies on the survivor. So we want to empower them to act independently rather than relying specifically on the advocate to do everything for them. So how do we show support? So of course we want to reinforce those small victories. Okay. Oh, I was able to save $50 this month. Perfect. Great. Okay. Even those small steps can make a difference. Okay. And you may start feeling more hopeful. So be mindful of making sure when you have survivors that have something positive or you notice something positive, congratulate them on that. Okay. Also, help them to discover certain resources, identify interpersonal, inner, and spiritual coping tools. And it just depends on the survivor, okay? And they could utilize those skills through whatever. Oh, okay, I decided to, the survivor may be like, hey, okay, I went to Open Door, okay, church, this weekend or whatever. Oh, great. How was that for you? Oh, I really like that. Okay. Are you gonna keep going? Oh, okay, great. Boom. Okay. So it's just encouraging from what they want, not us actually employing anything on them, but encourage them if you're seeing something like positive in them, and acknowledging that. Okay. So survivors must feel empowered to take actions and making sure advocates provide guidance, not direction. So as we tidy up with active listening and advocacy, so understand, remember that active listening actually validates our survivors' experiences and helps us build trust. And it helps us to actually build that supportive relationship, okay? Our job is to help survivors identify solutions. We don't make them for them and help them regain control over their lives, okay? Final thought is to make sure the best gift an advocate can offer is just truly listening. It is so powerful to just be able to have a survivor feel like they can actually have someone to call when they're having an issue, and actually listening to them. Okay. Active listening isn't just a skill, it's a way to empower, uplift, and support them. All right, so with trauma-informed care, so I'm sure many of you have heard me talk about this a lot, okay? And what this is an evidence-based approach on how we actually deliver victim or survivor-centered services, okay? The goal in TIC is to prevent re-victimization and prioritize safety for both our clients and, of course, for our staff. We want to recognize the widespread prevalence of trauma, what it looks like, and how it impacts individuals, okay? And also integrating the knowledge that you may have on how trauma actually may affect survivors, and have that knowledge be into our agency's policy and procedures. So, what are some key components of it? Number one, everyone has experienced trauma, okay? You could experience it directly or even indirect trauma, such as an advocate, listening to traumatic experiences every single day. Okay. So everyone experiences trauma differently and in their own way. Okay. Advocates and staff must work in an environment that acknowledges your own trauma history. So have that self reflection with yourself. Okay. A trauma informed system supports both our survivors and the employees. Okay. So when specifically with trauma-informed care, its aim is to ensure compassionate, informed, and effective care for both survivors and service policies. So who benefits from trauma-informed care? Well, it's very effective for many populations, but specifically when we're working with our survivors, children that are exposed to violence, okay? Be very knowledgeable that we get a lot of survivors that have experienced possible sexual assault as a child or even exposed to it, or maybe a survivor that has their own sexual assault history now has a child that experienced that. Okay. It is effective for adolescents with behavioral issues. So understand what those behavioral issues is, why they actually are reacting that way. Substance abuse, okay? So those that have co-occurring mental health diagnoses as well. So, you know, understanding that how their trauma plays an effect. Sometimes people use substance abuses as a way to cope, with the mental health and things like that. Those that are diagnosed with mental health, and of course, homeless mothers and marginalized communities. Okay. Trauma-informed care matters in those communities because those affected by interpersonal violence are disproportionately impacted. So we have to understand and be educated on trauma-informed care to address those systematic barriers and historical oppression. So what are the five main components of trauma-informed care? Well, as a trauma-informed agency, the five principles are number one, safety. Okay, so we have to make sure our survivors have physical and emotional safety, and this includes for both clients and staff. Of course, they have to be able to trust us. So provide that clear expectations and that consistent support. Okay. Choice. So survivors always can make their own decisions about their own care. Okay. That collaboration piece is big. Okay. So encourage teamwork between staff and survivors. Okay. Our aim is not to do things for you, tell you what to do, anything. It's a collaboration piece. Okay. So come to a decision where the survivor has the main, their role is to choose, but we actually will help them guide them through decision making. Okay. And then, of course, empowering them. Okay. We want to recognize and validate a survivor's strengths. Okay. Acknowledging when you see something positive. Okay. That can help a lot with motivation with survivors in doing more positive things, giving that positive feedback. Okay. Now, when it comes to shifting the perspective, so being a trauma informed, instead of like asking what's wrong with you, we don't want to ask that. It's very rude asking that specifically, but being trauma informed, we may ask what happened to you, okay? What kind of trauma did you experience, okay? And the key when we're utilizing trauma informed care, because it shifts the focus from actually judging to actually understanding them and actually empowering them. So when we're recognizing, we need to recognize and avoid re-traumatization as much as possible, okay? And now understand, given the line of work, sometimes it is inevitable. Sometimes, especially when we're having to do intakes, they do have to give us the information, but be very mindful of that, okay? Because unintentional re-traumatization can happen, okay? And when it happens, survivors feel a lack of control, okay? They can experience many unnecessary or even unexpected changes. Sometimes in their reaction, because they're being re-traumatized, they feel threatened or even attacked or even frightened or shamed or feel vulnerable, okay? So what are some examples of how re-traumatizations happens in systems? So like, for instance, like placing victims in a detention rather than a shelter, okay? Criminalizing people or criminalizing, let's just say like with adolescents, right? Putting them in that rather than actually figuring out what's really going on with why their behavior happens the way that it is. Sometimes those shelter night bed checks and curfews, just making sure, I understand we have our policies, but being mindful of how we're doing that. Okay. Unexpected changes in court dates. This is a big one. So court dates, changes happen all the time. Okay. You can support a survivor and work with them for months and months and making sure that they are prepared for court, working with their witness coordinator, maybe with the DA. And we work with them. And then the day of court happens, you get a text or an email, you get an email or call. Oh, court has been reset for 2 months from now. Okay. So a lot of that is, it happens very often. So that can be something that actually re-traumatizing clients because now you have another 2 months of holding on to all of this anticipation of the court. Okay. Understand survivors' behavior. So people have that notion and idea of how survivors should act. Okay. Sometimes survivors are unusual, they're inconsistent, or even show aggressive certain behaviors that stem from being re-traumatized, being faced with, the threat of, homelessness, um, there are many ways on how survivors actually can show that aggressive behaviors. So, as agencies, Sometimes adjusting that policy to reduce re-traumatization is necessary. So the key takeaway is recognizing and addressing re-traumatization and its role to help improve survivor outcome and engagement. So how do we implement trauma-informed care in agencies? Well, as an agency, we can develop policies based on those 5 core principles. Remember the safety, trust, choice, empowerment, and collaboration, making sure that your staff is ethically trained. So this includes all staff, your support staff, sometimes your janitorial staff, and the administration on trauma and its impact, okay? And then, of course, assess as a supervisor, assess that secondary trauma in your staff. Okay, some days are harder. Some situations are harder to take in. So being able to, I try to make sure I check on my staff. How are you guys doing? To avoid that burnout. Um, you don't look like yourself today, so checking in with your staff is important. Okay, even as a supervisor. Okay, I always tell my staff like, hey, your job is to take care of clients. My job is to take care of you. Okay. So the importance of your staff's well-being. Okay. Staff can be affected by that repetitive exposure to trauma in their work. And you can have hard days. Okay. As a staff member, making sure you feel comfortable coming to your supervisor. Okay. When you're needing just someone to vent to talk to. Maybe you're having a frustrated day, just having that safe space. Okay, a supportive work environment is everything, and it ensures that when your staff they feel safe, they can actually provide better survivor care as well. Okay, so the key takeaway is that trauma informed care supports both clients and staff to be truly effective. So when we talk about the differences between trauma-informed care and actually trauma-specific interventions, so of course, trauma-informed care is that systematic approach that discloses how trauma affects all aspects of care. As to trauma-specific interventions, this could be focusing on specifically treating certain trauma symptoms, like you may have a client that has PTSD or anxiety. So sometimes you may, okay, your client has anxiety, you may provide certain coping skills, with that anxiety. Okay, so those are specific interventions that you can do if you have clients that may have, like, for example, anxiety. Okay, address those re-victimization risks. So that's with trauma-informed care sometimes, using specific treatment models. So with the intervention, okay, so like a lot of the work that we do is strength-based, right? So we're working on clients by utilizing what their strengths are. So what are some things that their strengths, and using those strengths um, can help them with making decisions. So, you may have a client that's really good about being organized, or you may have a client that's really good about, oh, I utilize my planner. Okay, to address those things. And so using those strengths, to help them, you're really good at conveying when you're upset. So use that. You're very assertive when use that, So use that when you're working with your clients, okay? Also with trauma-informed care, you want to recognize trauma societal impact, okay? So when people do not have trauma-informed care and they look at even impoverished people in marginalized communities as, oh, the poor, they associate poor with crime. And crime does not matter whether you are rich, whether you are poor. We have to be mindful of our mindset and how we address those that have trauma as only associating those that are oppressed or have poverty, right? So we want to make sure that we're addressing it, but of course, it has a huge impact in how we as society view that through a lens. When we're talking about trauma-specific interventions, so this specifically want to target individual symptoms of trauma. Like we said, one of our core values is that person-centered care. Okay, so that means that it's not a one-size-fits-all. You need to learn and understand your client and what may work for your client. Okay, trauma-informed care is that holistic system-based approach, while trauma-specific interventions focus on that individual treatment. So how do we create a safe and trusting environment? Okay, so as an agency that tries to be trauma informed, does my client feel physically and emotionally safe in this place? Okay, ask yourself, is the environment welcoming? Are you welcoming? Okay, Do you make your clients feel comfortable and non-threatening? Okay. As supervisors, does your staff feel safe or supported in the workplace? Do they feel like they can come to you if they have a question? Okay. Can staff trust one another? So can coworkers, can you trust one another? Can you collaborate effectively within your department? Okay. And this matters because if you have issues where staff does not trust one another, it becomes difficult to provide that trauma-informed care to clients, okay? Remind you, you're in this work environment as well, so providing that ethical support to clients is imperative. And so agencies must try to foster that culture of trust, safety, and collaboration. All right, you guys, we have finished today. Like I said, I will be giving everyone the link to our YouTube page so you can start. It does have all of the trainings on there. Try to send an email because I do have a few people that did miss some of the trainings. So now you're able to actually watch them. And so as over the next few weeks, I will be uploading more of the videos. So just be mindful as soon as you watch any of those videos, just send me an email. I have your sheets to keep track of all of your trainings. The aim, like I said, is to be finished with everything by June 30th. Okay. And that's our last Tuesday session. Okay. I will make sure all of the events, I think all of the training have already been set. I will make sure that everyone gets all of the rest of those invites. But you guys have a wonderful day. Thank you so much for your support.